The way that we generally work is we have about an hour, we have a talk, and we have then conversation around it, or sometimes we have a workshop, which is what we're going to have today, which is going to be much more practical for you. There's a tin there for you to put 10p in the tin if you've had a cup of tea to help towards the costs. And because we're very collaborative, you're invited to help wash up in the kitchen round the corner at the end of the session, which you find is the most collaborative part perhaps of the day. So this is the first in a series that we're running all this term on thinking about the future and trying to make predictions for 2025. And the idea is that we'll collect those predictions on the website and keep them for posterity, so that in 13 years' time, is it? 12 years' time, you can come back and see whether you were right or not. And part of this is about, this came from my thinking that as academics we're all experts in something, but people very seldom ask us to think about the future, and you know, how using our current knowledge to kind of develop ideas of future foresight. So this very first session is designed to kind of just exercise your foresight muscles just a little bit and see if you can't make a few predictions yourself. And I'm basing it on the Institute for the Future, which is a think tank based in Palo Alto near Silicon Valley, near Stanford University, that I've been involved with for the past few years. So I couldn't decide whether to give you a kind of whole overview of future foresight, and then I thought I wouldn't do that because various speakers like Bernd and several others that we have this semester will be showing you different aspects of future foresight. So I thought rather than do that, I'd actually give you some practical experience of getting your hands dirty with it and see if it kind of stimulates any ideas. So I've gone to the Institute for the Future's toolkit website, and I pulled out 2 particular tools in the kit, and then I thought next week we might look, if you enjoy this session, we might look at 2 different tools in the kit next week, just to kind of keep it rolling. So what I am going to do is talk about, in the Future Foresight Toolkit, as you can see on the left, there are several different methods that they use for trying to predict trends and looking at how things might work in the future. And the first one that I thought we would try a hand at is signals. We're going to do signals and scenarios, and the scenario exercise is based a little bit on the first signals exercise. So to give you a sense of what signals are about, the idea of signals is looking for little bits of evidence or ideas that pop up now that look as though they might herald some kind of a change in the future. And we're going to be looking at newspapers to look for that. So, for example, let's just see what it says here about signals. So, innovations and disruptions. It says a signal is typically a small or a local innovation or disruption that has the potential to grow in scale and geographic distribution. So if you think back in the past about some things that have suddenly happened, Twitter perhaps would be a very good example. A small thing that suddenly appears that nobody really knows what to do with. If you were around in the first 3 months of Twitter's life, you would be in a very small group of people who would be using this tiny and seemingly totally pointless tool. But if you applied future foresight to it, you might say, well, where could this lead? You probably couldn't extrapolate to actually the huge effect that it has had on the world, but you could perhaps make some suggestions about that is one possible future for it. So Twitter in the very early first 3 months or so, I would say, was probably a signal, and a particular example would be the way that one particular person might have used Twitter, and how that might be a signal as to how things might change. I guess a good example would be when I ran the Amplified Leicester project here. We were actually taking work from the Institute for the Future about the amplified individual and sharing tools with them on the basis that they would then develop various skills in kind of amplifying themselves for the future workplace. And one of the people that we worked with was a police inspector. And this was maybe about a year or so after Twitter really kicked off. And he wanted to use Twitter in the police force in Leicestershire, and his bosses didn't want him to. He really had to work hard to persuade them. And in the end they said, okay, you know, you can have a few police Twitter accounts. And for several months nothing really happened until the National Defence League came to Leicester, and they were using Twitter as a way to pass around false rumours and cause disturbances. So the police were then able to also go in and use Twitter and you know, counteract those rumours and so on. So you might say that the reporting of that day and the way that Twitter was used, that one day was a signal that actually there's something important going on here. But not everybody would necessarily have recognised it. So that's the idea of signals, is looking for those small moments. So it says here a signal can be a new product or a new practice or a marketing strategy, all kinds of things. And it says signals are useful if you're trying to interpret a highly uncertain future. So one of the things about the notion of using signals for future foresight is that you are extrapolating lots of different ideas, some of which might have legs and work and some of which will just fall away, and we don't know at this point which. So the first exercise I'm going to ask you to do is to share or pick up a newspaper together. I've bought several newspapers and they're all kind of scattered around. And I'd like to divide you up into 4 groups. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So what I want you to do is just go through the paper and look for signals, but about a specific thing, which is food. So I want you to look for mentions of food, farming, agriculture, industry, share prices, all kinds of things, and see if you can spot anything in the paper that might be a signal for how food might develop by 2025. And I'm going to get you some post-it notes so you can record them. There's some post-its. If you come across a signal, write it on the post-it and we'll stick it up on that wall there. Post-its, if you come across any signals. Post-its for your signals, and over there. So 1 signal per post-it, and then we'll stick them up on the walls. You've got about 3 minutes left to put some signals on post-its and put them on the wall. About 3 more minutes. Okay, time to stop, I think. So do you want to stick your post-its on the wall behind you, and then we'll go round and you can just briefly explain what your signals are. Should we start at this end? Okay, everybody, we're going to share our signals quite briefly, so don't worry about spending too much time on it. Well, not at this point. Yeah, just stick them on the wall behind you. So, okay, let's start off with you then.
The first one I found was, I'm going to read this out as it is. Schools in Blackpool offering free breakfast for all pupils as an aid to poor families, and potentially if that was to be rolled out across the UK as an effort in kind of easing off the rising food prices.
So by 2025?
Potentially could be rolled out.
Okay, free breakfast by 2025. That's great, thanks. Is that 2 signals you got there?
The other one is adverts for price matching on groceries could potentially be representative of a shift towards a kind of standardised pricing system for food in the future.
Oh, that's a nice one. Neil?
Global warming slowdown seems to be in the news. So any sort of macro effects will change people's availability of food. I'm suggesting that the effect of global warming on some of the food sources might be less. You know, this year we've had all sorts of things with American drought and UK floods that put costs up. And child benefit cuts as austerity bites, people move, I guess, to more budget foods. Has economic and health issues.
So what's your 2025 prediction for that, for the child benefit? How might that affect in terms of food by 2025? Any?
I get scurvy.
Scurvy.
Yeah.
Rickets
Could be a question of health, couldn't it?
Health
Yeah.
issues, yeah. And a balance that perhaps the costs of health, because you're cutting your food quality, then you get increased costs in the health service.
Yeah.
That means the policymakers are going backwards and forwards on a seesaw.
But you're going to get free breakfast in a different scenario. Yes. Not the same scenario. Okay, how about this group? You've got 4 signals.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I think one was there seemed to be a questioning of the link between health and the food that you ate. There seemed to be there were 2 different articles. One was about alcohol and suggesting that it could have a positive rather than a negative effect, and that the evidence wasn't actually conclusive.
So
And
a
it was the
breakfast
super- well, I don't know if it's kind of same with the superfoods, and it just seemed that maybe that was the signal that there was going to be less kind of focus on eating for health, and it would maybe move. In one of the articles is written by DNA experts, so whether there'll be more kind of focus on that kind of side of things rather than what you eat.
They're saying that
affects you.
superfoods might actually enhance your risk of cancer.
That's what they were saying,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So we kind of assume that as we move ahead, we're going to be more and more health aware and efficient, but you're saying that actually it could go in reverse.
Which is interesting.
It's a positive signal,
because
yeah.
I was just thinking, in the Times, apparently they're doing a promotion for quick and easy and tasty recipes over the weekend, and it's this focus on simple recipes rather than quite often it's the I don't know, it's either the health or it's the very kind of dinner party-ish gourmet food that they do. So I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting
austerity
link.
cooking.
Yeah,
Yes.
which then ties in with what you were saying as well. And although ironically, I suppose the other big thing was Delia Smith's contract with Waitrose is ending and she's not renewing it, so it'll just leave Heston Blumenthal. Obviously, it's a very different form of cooking to Delia. So again, I
Does
don't
it say
know
why
whether-
she's not
Oh,
renewing?
apparently it's a natural end of contract. That's what
All right.
Right.
But
Lots of confusing signals there, really, aren't they? Going in different directions. Thank you. You've got how many?
Did you get yours? Oh, you
Yeah, you.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
You've got the most signals, so you get the prize for that.
It's all little snippets.
Is the free school breakfast same?
Same as that. Downgrading of luxury drinks, so people are migrating from champagne to prosecco, apparently.
So by 20,
Middle.
so by 2025, what?
Tesco's has
we'll be
recovered
drinking Lambrine
in terms of its bad market share last year. Floods in Syria have sparked food riots. What's the social services and poverty one? Was that the same as the?
That was the starvation. The girl being starved.
Oh yeah, and the relatives are suing the council for not intervening.
Where was
so
she?
a girl starved to death at home.
What?
This is,
At her home or at
Yeah,
a council
her
home?
Basically,
siblings.
a mother starved her to
Her
death.
mother
Oh.
starved, but the siblings are suing the council, which is an interesting one. So it's about, litigation and the responsibility of the state. Prince Charles is, at the one hand, promoting sustainability, and on the other hand, he's developing supermarkets on the duchy. So we've got contradiction in the royal mind.
That's not
The
new.
Australian weather map has been recalibrated.
So what will Prince Charles be by 2025?
Dead, I think. They've recalibrated the weather map for Australia, and they've brought up the top temperature to 54 degrees because the weather has been so extreme. So they can no longer represent the weather properly. So obviously it's had lots of droughts and it's getting worse.
So by 2025,
60
Maybe
degrees.
60,
yeah. I mean, it's this kind of local effect of global warming being concentrated in certain areas.
so what can you grow and what animals can you have at that temperature?
You can't.
Camels,
It's desert.
academics.
Well, 50 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's Death Valley temperatures. And
Is
there's
it?
not much going on there,
So
apart from lunatic extreme marathon
Yes.
runners.
Absolutely more of those. And there was the conflict in Syria has left 1 million people hungry. So it's the extreme
rising
food crisis of local
rising conflict
crises,
means famine, blah blah blah,
and knock-on things like we've seen food riots in Syria. So it's all connected.
or the general sort of milieu around food security.
Yeah. Right. So quite a few signals, some joining together and some being very far apart. So let's look at the next phase. I've got 2 exercises for you. So this is the second one, which is a scenario planning exercise that they did called 4 Futures of Food. So, where are we? In scenarios, that's what we're going to do now, is plan a scenario. So the idea about scenarios is that they become much more complicated than just the signals. So you're trying to basically make a story out of the scenarios. So as it says here, they take us into a possible future and describe a world to come, make a set of assumptions about the drivers that might shape that world. So we've already got several possible scenarios starting to rise out of this, which are quite different from each other. And I think sometimes when you're thinking about the future, that's where you get stuck. We have this conversation and there are so many possibilities that you kind of get a bit blurred about it all. So it helps to tease out those possible scenarios and trying to develop them a bit and go down roads a little bit further. So they have some examples here on their site of the California Dreaming Map, Reinventing Energy Futures, and 4 Futures of Food. So I thought we'd work on that. I was thinking about spending the session working on the future of education, but we're kind of too close to that really, aren't we, right now? So I thought food would be more appropriate. So I'll send you the link to all of this later on so that you can look into it in more detail. But basically, they came up with 4 scenarios, and I'm going to briefly summarise them for you, and then I'm going to hand out a scenario to each group for you to work on. And I'll do it randomly, so we'll see what you come up with. So at this point, you'll be able to share each other's signals and obviously look for more signals if you haven't finished looking at the papers. So they said that they found examples of 4 different directions of change in the global food web. So the first one they suggested was the notion of growth. So they said that I'll kind of read this out, it's probably the easiest way. In the early 1970s, the US Department of Agriculture adopted new kinds of policies, so that's a signal, that encouraged farmers to produce as much food as their land could bear. This reversed decades of government caps on production, and the ensuing growth in the availability of commodity crops like corn helped to bring down the prices of animal feed. The whole history of corn growing in the States is horrendous when you look into it. Corn syrup is in just about everything because they were producing so much, making so much money. So brought down the prices of animal feed, ushered in a boom in meat consumption. As a result, obesity has increased dramatically. Whilst at the same time in other parts of the world hunger is also increasing. So the idea of growth in one area can bring about just that one particular, just by investing in that kind of agriculture and helping farmers grow more, you're sending everything in a particular direction of growth. So the group who get growth for their scenario might want to think about what could we do now, or what is already happening now that could be pushing us in a growth direction, and where could it lead. Another one is collapse. Talks about the Dust Bowl in the US in the 1930s, when, if you remember, all the major food growing areas of the US turned to desert, basically. Displaced many people, led to widespread poverty and hunger, and it suggests that today's fisheries are in a similar situation, that fisheries are already collapsing. So if we look to 2025, what could it be like if more food industries had also collapsed? What would they likely to be and what would the effects be? The third signal or area for scenario is constraint. They talk about the Second World War, the way that food production and distribution was really badly affected by the Second World War. And then they talk about rationing systems, price management, legislation brought out to make sure that the food was shared around properly. Now, what would happen? Are there any signals now that look as though we might be pushed in that direction? And what might be the end effect in 2025 if we went in the direction of constraint? So we've got growth, collapse, constraint, and then the fourth one is transformation. So that's where we look about the amazing changes in food industry technologies and how all kinds of foods are now being produced and also brought from halfway across the world for our supermarkets. Family members, as it says here, individually heating up their meals, so they're not eating together, meals eaten alone in cars, refrigeration is changing the kind of things that we eat and when we eat them. So the kind of benefits of technology changing the food that we eat is also changing us socially. So how could we be transformed in our kind of eating and follow-on social habits by 2025 if that industry continues to develop? What could you see? So I think all of those four scenarios are kind of embedded in some of the signals that you've come up with. So I've got here some flip charts, the inevitable flip charts, and some pens. So what I'd like each group to do is to start some scenario planning on a flip chart for each group and see how far we get. So I'm going to hand out a scenario which gives you more information about your particular scenario, and it also, you'll see, it talks in the panel about a typical family. What they did for this was they kind of said, okay, if we take a typical family, how will this scenario affect that family? So you might choose to look at that or not, that's up to you. But I'm just going to hand these out randomly now. So there's several copies of that. That's your scenario. That's your group scenario. Oops, that's your group scenario and yours. So we've got 10 minutes to... We can make it 15. So it's 10 to 2, so we're already running out of time. So should we briefly go round and kind of... It's quite interesting because I've talked to nearly everybody, and so you're all coming up with quite interesting scenarios that are often overlapping with each other. So should we just quickly go around? Do you want to start in this corner?
Yeah, we basically decided that...
so you had constraint, just so everybody...
We had constraint, and we decided to posit left and right scenarios, basically depending on the political climate. So if I describe the left scenario first, we're looking at the sort of tried and tested device of rationing, which is obviously a device that's been used in wartime and is ostensibly egalitarian in its approach, although of course it can be subverted. We're looking at dietary changes. We are looking at socially or state-regulated production methodologies, and basically what we were describing here is a community-based cycle of production and consumption. So that is all based upon some form of community, whether that's spatial or identity-based or whatever we could debate.
But it's a move back towards
localism. Yes, kind of collectivism, shall we say, a form of collectivism. We would envisage a role for compulsory recycling, and the overarching regulative structure is one that depends on solidarity rather than compulsion, but there have to be some elements of compulsion. So that's our sort of left-centred way of dealing with constraint and scarcity. Then on the right, which we sort of feel is the trajectory that we're on, for obvious reasons. Instead of food rationing, we just have the price mechanism, the traditional mechanisms of the market forces in a capitalist society. We would anticipate that society would allow food poverty, high levels of food poverty. And I know we've heard a lot about food poverty in public policy over the last decade, 15 years or so. We imagine that would intensify. Instead of a regulated production cycle and community-based consumption, we would anticipate a cycle based on charity. Depending on which strand of the right you were on, there would be a focus on family and perhaps on nation. Or alternatively laissez-faire and self-help. So there could be no social dimension to it at all. If you're a liberal, a sort of conservative dimension if you're a conservative. Recycling we would see as being basically it would be voluntary rather than regulated, and there would be of course a market for it. So it would depend to an extent on how far there is any kind of commercial advantage to be derived for it, whether people are running recycling operations. And then instead of social solidarity, the whole sort of setup would depend on fairly authoritarian policing, we think.
So if they see you eating a sandwich in the street, you've had it.
You'd be very, very rich if you could afford
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That very interestingly kind of segues into some of the conversations you were having. So you have collapsed, is that right?
We've collapsed, yes. Well, we've decided there's no more market, there's rationing. Presumably when half the British population is starting to starve, then even the right is going to go for rationing. Food is a luxury. Food is a luxury, but it turns from what is now as an expression of self as a means of sustenance. There'll be lots of cultural changes that we find. So, for example, it'll be great to be fat again. Sign of being upper class, to be able to be to not have to work and be fat.
Corpulence.
Yes, that might be the more political way of saying it. We also assume there'll be a use of communal space for food production. So you grow your food in your own garden, but you also grow your food in the middle of the estate. There'll be a lot of sharing, partly because of the rationing in the family. People will share. There'll be shared meals again. Family is great. Everybody comes together because that's the only place you get anything to eat at all.
You can have the dip of the potato.
That sort of thing. There'll be, of course, black markets, and we presume there'll be a black market, for example, for pet parts. Now, if you want a cat to eat, then you'll have to go to the black market.
Cat tail.
So there'll be lots of positive sides as well. There'll be a decrease of obesity. As a consequence of that, there'll be a decrease of heart disease, less cancer. People live longer and have even less to eat, which is sort of a vicious circle there.
This collapse sounds great to me.
No, I think that's about sums it up actually. Yeah.
So those are the things that,
Thank you. So we've had constraint, collapse, and now we have transformation.
Well, we didn't go so far on this one. One of the points was meat shortage, and the increases in prices mean that technology alternatives that might have been less acceptable become promoted and become successful.
We're all eating corn.
We're eating corn or lab-grown meat or whatever. But if you consider it as a sort of cycle, as a causal loop, if you then move to lab-grown meat, then meat shortage goes down, the prices then come down, and the drivers towards using the technology alternatives are less. So you tend to get a stabilisation, and people can continue as they were because of the technological transformations, which is really what we had in the Green Revolution of the 60s, with improved agriculture and improved breeding of rice plants. meant that you could produce foods and you could sustain the population growth and the behaviour in the culture as it stands. So technological transformation seems to be perhaps something that merely delays collapse to some later point. But Sue was suggesting that perhaps by 2025 the technological transformation, the next one has run its course, and then you're moving again to a situation where you have another transformation or you get the collapse scenario.
And it's made me wonder as well about the political impact of what you're talking about worldwide, and kind of people are saying that the genetic food industries and so on, that previously starving countries would have plenty of food, and of course that would then change their
But
politics.
what about energy required to turn technology into food, and how does that equation work?
Well,
because I suspect there'll be very high energy overheads, and it may not be a sustainable way to develop.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's systems, isn't it? It's all so interlinked. So for the States now, with the US, with the development of fracking, they would probably for a while begin to get the energy that they could do this type of food production. And maybe politically, I think a shift from globalization to localization, and a sort of backlash against what we've had in the last sort of 30, 40 years. Globalization is great, it's the only way forward.
You mean generally, or just in relation? So deglobalization in relation to food, or generally?
Well, I was thinking actually generally, I'm thinking food, but also in anything. So the US is already thinking about bringing some production back.
But they're looking at countries are looking at self-sufficiency, aren't they?
And tariffs.
Yeah.
And indeed, yes, putting up barriers. So with localization, you get barriers even maybe down to the communities. People start protecting them, and then you could go feudal, really.
Feudal? Have you got any feudal? Well, I've forgotten what your... I forgot.
Also something that was based on a kind of financial growth.
Oh.
And I think it appears to be more reliant on financial growth than a growth in sort of food production. So it's I think a little bit different to some of the others, but it kind of pictures a scenario where people are living on more of a processed food diet, because you have a kind of the cheapness with which it can be produced because of advances in technology which have been made mean that you can mass produce things which are cheap and easy to access. So we were kind of identifying what some of the sort of the negative issues we're trying to identify, and then the series of what you might be able to do now to try and regulate that scenario, if that makes sense. So related to the processed food diet, then is the fact that it's not a hugely nutritious diet, but it's very easy to market in positive ways which aren't necessarily relied on nutrition. So it can be marketed on the fact that it's particularly green or something, or it could be marketed in because it's cheap to have or easily accessible, but that does overlook the fact that it might not be a nutritious way of living. So you have rises in heart disease and obesity and things like that, again, it's related to that. The fact that the growth is mostly focused on wealthier regions means that the access in poorer regions is limited to the much cheaper end of the food that's produced. And there's a perception of dieting which as an all-round health solution, which is kind of attached to the first one. The idea that dieting is not just a kind of a losing weight thing that you see now, but is an all-round general well-being kind of solution, which kind of implies a lack of education on dietary requirements and things. And that also the scenario predicts a generation gap in the understanding of nutrition generally between parents and the children and raising in that situation. And then do you want to talk to the sort of preventative suggestions?
Solutions we've got were to regulate personalised food marketing, because one of the future scenarios were that people would get things sent to their smartphones advising them what to buy and what diets to go on and things.
Based on previous Tesco shopping.
Yeah.
So your corn oozes out of your phone.
Yeah. So we thought that there should be improved education on diet and increased tax on sort of high salt, sugar, fatty foods now to stop them.
Because if they become that easy and cheap to produce, then...
We thought we should regulate prices for food and increase fair trading with food growers to equal the balance out, and to fund research into dietary requirements and the health effects, because one of the examples is this lady who's on the Dr. No Carb diet or something, and we thought if we funded better research into diets, then people would be better informed to make choices in the future. And investment in a wider range of agriculture. I'm not sure what that means.
But because if things now are so cheap that they can become that level of mass produced, then there needs to be an element of regulation to bring that into balance. Otherwise, the focus gets shifted all down one channel into a certain kind of agricultural produce. Whereas if you regulate it at an earlier stage, then by the end point it might be less focused towards that one cheap solution.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry for running on a bit, but thank you. I mean, so the kind of the end result of all of this is that I thought this was a bit of an experiment about how it feels to work in a future foresight think tank where you're given problems like this, signals to look at, and then to bring all your different knowledges and so on to bear towards thinking about them in quite a practical way. So that's just really a taster of doing future foresight, and what I wanted to do was maybe encourage people to think about in your own area, could you do this if you sat down and said, right, I'm going to take what I'm already expert in and see if I could make some predictions for 2025 out of my own knowledge and my own signals, you know, what would be the outcome. So that's really it for today. That's just the first introduction. I was thinking I might carry on next week and do a similar thing with some other tools, because we haven't got anything booked in for next week. So I could do another session like this, but carrying on with different tools, if you'd like. I'll plan something like that. It's more just a thing about to give you a sense of how it feels to do it, because we're not asked to do it very often.
But maybe we could do it on something that we can publish.
Absolutely.
So that we use our collective knowledge in a way that really has some value.
Yeah.
So it might have to veer back towards university concerns in some way.
Well, we could focus next week on universities, on education. They did do a whole series of work on education, the future of education. So we could base it on that, but use a different tool, not...
Yeah.
Because we've done signals and scenarios, use a different tool, but look at education next week. Great. Okay, and I'll circulate the information that we've worked on today to the list. So thank you very much for coming.